It's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. On Fridays this year, I've been talking to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Stuart MacAdam. Stuart, are you with me?
I am indeed, Ned. Hello.
Hello, thanks for being a guest on Cooper Friday. Now, Stuart, would you like to provide an introduction for the audience, just in case someone has clicked on this and they've never heard of D.B. Cooper before? What would you say about him?
Yep, so the D.B. Cooper case is the only unsolved skyjacking in US history, and it starts with a man in 1971 boarding a plane the day before Thanksgiving, and he bought a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle, which is a small flight. It's really a milk run. And he hijacked the airline, saying that he had a bomb in his briefcase and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. And then he, ransoms the passengers on the plane for the money, lets the passengers go. The plane takes off en route to Reno. He originally wanted to go to Mexico City, but they didn't have the ability to do that with the flight setup. And then somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, he jumps out of the plane with the money and the bomb, and he hasn't been seen or heard from since.
Now, Stuart, you were recently a guest on the Cooper Vortex with Darren Schaefer, and I noticed that you made a lot of observations about some of the far out and wild theories that people have in regards to D.B. Cooper. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this. Say, for example, what do you make of the theory that D.B. Cooper was a conspirator among the flight attendants and the crew and the staff, and they were all in it together, and that this was something that was organized by the flight crew?
It's a good theory, I guess, if you've never been involved in the case or not actively looked at the actual facts of the case, Ned. It's quite easy to sort of come to that conclusion thinking that it's the best explanation. But all you need to do is have a look at the 302s that the FBI has been releasing about the actual transcripts between the crew and D.B. Cooper, and you'll realize quite quickly that this was someone that was very much on the outside. He wasn't associated or connected to the flight crew in any shape or form. And the flight crew had really good jobs at the time. This was the golden age of flying. A lot of the flight attendants, the pilots, the crew had very good jobs that were very stable, and in times of great economic challenges, it was a good industry to be a part of. So for them to just put all of that on the line for $200,000, which would have had to have been split many different ways, essentially you're looking at saying the crew here was willing to give up their careers and risk going to jail for anywhere from $25,000 to $40,000, which really in the grand scheme of things is not a lot of money to risk all of that for. So it's quite ridiculous to think that he'd be in on it. And the other thing too is, if he was part of the airline industry or the aviation industry, would you not have thought that someone in the flight crew would have noticed him? So a big suspect that comes up quite a lot is Kenny Christensen. Would you not think, Ned, that Alice Hancock or Florence Schaffner or Tina Mucklow would have looked very closely and thought, hey, Kenny, is that you? Is that you under all the makeup and the glasses? So, the theory in itself kind of falls over before you can even put too much thinking into it.
Yes, and of course, Kenny Christensen also worked for Northwest Orient, right? The same airline that was hijacked by D.B. Cooper, right?
Correct.
Oh, yes, and I was talking about him, yes, last week on Cooper Friday when I did the book discussion on Into the Blast by Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins. But this is going to bring us to a different direction in the conversation, Stuart, and that is this D.B. Cooper story one where you focus on the suspects, or is it one where you are just looking at the evidence, where you're looking at like the profiles, and you mentioned the 302s, the FBI reports? Is it one where you're just going to be following the facts, or do you analyze the suspect profiles?
Ned, it's always interesting to look at the suspect profiles, because the thing about the D.B. Cooper case is that there are so many interesting suspects that have come up as a result of this investigation. If you have a look at just a few of them, let's look at Wolfgang Gossett, Kenny Christensen, Sheridan Peterson, Milton Vordahl, even, suspects that aren't the greatest, like Vince Peterson or, to a lesser extent, Walter Recker. All of those people have got a very interesting backstory. And then you look at ones which were, sort of very heavily favored for a long time, like Richard McCoy, for example, and by some people still is preferred, or Robert Rackstraw. All of them have got very interesting backgrounds and have led very interesting lives. So to just say that, it's not worth looking at suspects at all, we should just focus completely on the evidence, I think you might miss a golden opportunity to actually begin to align the story quite nicely with someone who might be well positioned to be a suspect based on the type of background which they have as a person. And I think ultimately when the DB Cooper suspect is eventually confirmed to be the actual person, it probably likely will be either one of the people who has worked in the titanium industry, or it'll be someone who that we've never heard of before. And looking at it just from a facts point of view, it's actually very, very difficult to narrow down that person unless you have some type of DNA evidence, unless you've got a ticket stub, a parachute, a $20 bill that Cooper jumped out of the plane with. It's going to be very hard to identify who it was without those things. But if you've got like a backstory, like a circumstantial case, that can at the very least be investigated and analyzed objectively by other investigators, whether it's amateur or professional, it'll be interesting to see if that can lead you sort of to the path. So I would say having those other suspects brought in is actually a good way to keep the interest in the case going, because if you didn't have these new suspects and you didn't have these new developments, it would be very hard to keep the interest going. And thankfully, one of the few good things that Thomas Colbert has done is he's actually gotten the FBI to release the 302 documents which pertain to the DB Cooper case, which is all of the investigation notes, all of the transcripts and stuff of the interactions which DB Cooper had with the flight crew, all of the investigative work that was done. And it really helps you to find new pieces of information that might help us to actually hone down and pick up on possible leads which may lead us closer to the suspect.
Does this mean that you don't have a DB Cooper suspect at all?
I don't. I wish I did, but I think there's just not sufficient evidence yet to conclusively say that it's this person or that person. I would probably need to see some pretty hard evidence, Ned, to be convinced that it was, say, for example, Milton Vordahl, or it was Ted Braden. Like, there would need to be DNA evidence. There would need to be, as I mentioned before, like a $20 bill, a ticket stub in his, lost possessions, in order for it to be convincing. But at the moment, it just doesn't have the concrete evidence available, which needs to be there in order for enough people to say, yep, this is sufficient to close the case.
Okay, fascinating. But because in this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the myths of the DB Cooper case, and one of them is something that I get from time to time in the comments section here on Black Box Online Radio. And if you want to follow along with all of these Cooper Friday episodes, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. But sometimes people will say, DB Cooper didn't jump out of the plane. The reason why they haven't found the parachute or something that DB Cooper was carrying is because he was hiding in a secret compartment on the plane. What do you make of that claim?
Well, it's quite a crazy claim because that plane was thoroughly searched. If you have a look at the people that were investigating it, it was agents down on the ground. They surrounded the plane. They went in quite quickly and searched for fingerprints and any other traces of the hijacker. They searched every nook and cranny of the plane. They had dogs, as far as I'm aware, searching the plane as well. So if he was hiding on there somewhere, they definitely would have found him. And lest we forget as well that Tina Mucklow was still up at the front of the plane and she had seen the face of the hijacker. So if there was any doubt about someone who was unidentified on the plane at the time, that wasn't an agent, All they needed to do was ask Tina, was this the man that you were engaging with before? And if she said yes, it would have been game over. So it's quite ludicrous to say that he didn't jump off the plane as well for that reason. And also as well because there was oscillations that took place at a certain time, and that speaks to him jumping out of the plane just based on the sled test that was done afterwards to conclusively prove that the aft stairs actually bounced up back against the plane before going down a little bit again.
Okay, well, very good to clear up some of this stuff. But I do have a very big question for you, Stuart, and that is, do you think that the DB Cooper case will be solved in our lifetime?
I think it will, Ned. There's so many developments which have been happening at such an accelerated rate with the 302 files. And if you have a look at the great work that Eric Eulis and Ryan Burns and Darren Schaefer with hosting the Cooper Vortex and having all of these fantastic guests on, like Chris Brower and Chris Cunningham as other examples, there are so many smart, intelligent people that are doing a wonderful amount of investigative work into the case and having a look quite substantially at all of the evidence that the FBI pulled together, but just, sort of ran out of, I guess, sort of like time and man hours to sort of properly process a lot of it. And I think with the work that they're doing, that we will get close to identifying him at some point. It'll probably be narrowed down to maybe about 1 to 500 viable suspects, and then from there it's kind of just a numbers game of slowly pulling the numbers down even further, and eventually that person will be identified, and it probably will surprise all of us as to exactly who it is.
Okay, this will tie into the next question then. Do you believe that they have a good, solid sample of DB Cooper's DNA?
Not at the moment. Unfortunately, they did have very good evidence, which was the cigarette butts, which he smoked throughout the duration of the flight, probably to keep himself calm and relieve some stress that he was under for obvious reasons. But in terms of the other DNA evidence, a lot of it has gotten mixed up. You could always try and get some more touch DNA with some of the advances that they've made on, like the parachute that was cut up whilst he MacGyvered the bank bag shut. But in terms of conclusive DNA evidence, I would say that the tie is probably the only thing that's truly available, and a lot of that's sort of just down to the different particles that are on it, rather than like sort of conclusive DNA. Does that mean that we can't get a DNA sample at some point? No. I mean, we possibly can, but I think that the particles is probably the best indicator and the best way of figuring out who this person was, or at the very least, what part of the country he's from and what his personality was like.
And when you say particles, are you referring to the metallic particles that were found on DB Cooper's tie?
Yeah, correct. Like the titanium, antimony, the gold, all of that stuff.
Now, what do you make of that? Because DB Cooper, of course, is on the plane. He's wearing a suit. He has a black tie with a pearl tie clip. And the tie was a clip-on, and that was left behind on Cooper's seat. Now, do you think that these metallic particles that were found on DB Cooper's tie indicate that he was a scientist? Was he an engineer? Was he someone who worked maybe in the railroad industry? Or is it just a false lead? Like, is it going down the wrong track? Do you think it shows any clues about DB Cooper's profession, or is it just kind of a dead end?
It's something which definitely limits the types of suspects that you should be looking for. So there's a great website called dbcooperhijack.com, which actually has a section dedicated to some of the fallacies of the case. And just to sort of quote him, one of the things that he says, only one clip-on tie was analyzed. No other ties from other industries were used for comparison. Spiral aluminium shavings were found, which makes it more likely that the tie came from someone who worked in a machine shop, not some super secret factory Railroads had machine shops at every rail yard. The clip-on tie was well worn and dirty, which is not the kind of tie worn in a high-tech factory setting like at Boeing. However, it would have fit perfectly at a railroad repair facility. So I think it's definitely indicative that it was someone that was working in that type of industry, and it does reduce it to um, those types of workers. So people that either worked in the sort of like the titanium industry or worked in the railroad industry. It's very unlikely it was someone that just worked at like a retail shop that sold jeans, for example, or some high-flying CEO person. It was definitely someone that was more like on the front line of like production of different products, and whether that was in the titanium or railroad industry, I can't say definitively, but it's likely that that's what the tie was exposed to, and whoever DB Cooper was worked in an industry where he was regularly exposed to particles like that. And something that's lesser mentioned, which a lot of people can overlook, is that gold was found in the same percentage as the titanium, and yet no one's saying that DB Cooper worked at a gold mine, for example. So it's important to look at all of the particles that were on that tie, Ned.
Well, this will tie into the next question because Dr. David G. Hubbard has written a couple books about the psychological profiling of skyjackers, and it relates to some of the things that you just said because he claims in the majority of skyjacking cases, the perpetrator was an underperformer, someone who was in a period of financial hardship, but also working a low-level job. And everything that you just said sounds quite to the contrary of that, or at the very least, you're keeping an open mind when you're saying that this could be somebody in production, but there could be someone who's a little bit more advanced. And I guess the full question would be, do you think that DB Cooper was more or less an underperformer in life who really was desperate for $200,000? Or do you think that this is somebody who did it for the thrill of it? I know it's a big bunch of word salad there, but that's the ultimate question at the end.
He's definitely someone that was an underperformer in some areas of his life, probably areas that mattered quite significantly to him, which is probably why he decided to commit the skyjacking in the first place. I don't think he was just doing it for the thrill of it, because there's so many other ways you could get an amazing thrill, an amazing adrenaline rush without having to skyjack a plane. Because to use the words of Ralph Himmelsbach, Ned, who was one of the FBI agents in Portland on the day of the hijacking, he risked his life to hijack the airliner. He didn't get to spend the money. He may have lost his life. Now, the second two parts of that statement we can maybe talk about a little bit later, but the first part, he risked his life to hijack the airliner. Someone who is in a sound frame of mind, in a good life position, is not going to risk their life to hijack an airliner. It's someone that is desperate in some way. I do think that DB Cooper likely did have money problems, likely as a result of, sort of either marital disharmony and, sort of being behind in paying off various debts, someone that might have lost his job, a combination of those two things. And he just needed some money and he wanted to find an escape. And he saw this opportunity to skyjack, something which had never been done before. And he wanted to take the opportunity and go and do it before someone else got in on the idea, and the investigators were able to get more sophisticated with their tracking and investigative techniques. So he really was able to catch them at a very good time for someone that was in quite a desperate situation in life. I think when we find out who DB Cooper is, Ned, because I am convinced the case will be solved in our lifetime, we will probably find that there was some sort of family problems, likely marital problems, and likely problems with like financial debt or similar problems, because otherwise there are so many other ways that you can address other things. If you look at someone that's in a poor financial position, for example, sometimes it's not hard to work two jobs to pay that debt off. But if you've also got a family that resents you, your incentive to work those two jobs to pay off the debt suddenly just decreases a lot more. So I think that's something that definitely needs to be looked into a lot more, as well as the PTSD as well, because it's very likely that DB Cooper was a veteran. And one thing that I said at the end of Darren Schaefer's podcast on the Cooper Vortex when I appeared there as a guest was that I think there should be more investigation into the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder and how it could possibly have been part of DB Cooper's psyche, because we did see at various times in the hijacking, based on the 302s and the other books that were written about the case, that there were times that DB Cooper lost his cool. And if that can be attributed to PTSD, then it'll give us a much greater insight into not only who it was, but why they did it. And, I'm leaning more towards the desperation side.
Okay, wow, fascinating. And I want to remind everybody that I'm talking to Stuart MacAdam. He runs a website called PaidAdvertisingHelp.com. And in addition to hitting the like button and subscribing here, you can also go through some of the links in the description box for Black Box Online Radio. One of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxonlineradio allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday, talking about the Zodiac Killer every Monday, about Jack the Ripper every Wednesday, and of course, you're listening to Cooper Friday, talking about DB Cooper. Now, in this episode, Stuart, we're going to go through some of the myths and commonly held beliefs that people have about the DB Cooper case. And we were just talking about the money. What do you think happened to the money that DB Cooper obtained, the $200,000? Where did it go? Why wasn't it found in circulation? What are the explanations for that?
Ned, I think he lost the money when he jumped out of the plane. Unfortunately, all of his MacGyvering of the bank canvas bag was not good enough for his efforts to secure it properly to his body and escape with it, the money. And I think he lost it when he jumped out of the plane. I think it detached sometime between when he jumped out and sort of seconds after he deployed the parachute. So while he was still in free fall. And I think the money just made its way down to Tina Bar. And if you have a look at the new proposed flight path by Eric Ulis that he has put out, I think that flight path is reasonably close and aligns probably well with the washdown theory, that the money sort of found a way to Tina Bar and ended up there. Whether it was dredged, I don't think so. I think it fell down somewhere. And then with the flooding that happened a couple of years later, it built up and washed down to Tina Bar and was planted there. And whether human hands were involved in transporting it to its exact location, I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty confident that he lost the money on the jump. I don't believe in the Washougal washdown theory, which, there's no evidence to support that. And I don't think it was a situation where DB Cooper just went and buried some money at Tina Bar to just troll the FBI either.
Okay, though, you mentioned the flight path, and Eric Ulis has stated publicly that he believes that the flight path is a little bit different than what some other people commonly think. And that was my next question for you. Do we know with 100% certainty the flight path that the plane was using to go from Seattle heading southbound toward Reno?
Yes. It's something which can often be misunderstood as well. But if you have a look at the flight path itself, like Vector 23 is not just a straight arrow. It's like a highway in the air, effectively. And the Sage radar tracking system that was being used to record the plane at the time was the best in the world, Ned. And does that mean that the plane couldn't have veered outside of the radius of Vector 23 for a period of time? Well, sure, maybe it could have. But I think there needs to be some adjustments made in order to explain the Tina Bar money find, because that's the big part. I think about 95% of that flight path is accurate in how it was drawn out, but there needs to be that part where, DB Cooper jumps out, like what time that was and when that was. We can maybe discuss that sometime in the conversation, but the part where he sort of jumps out and where he loses the money, there needs to be some explanation for that, because we can't just keep on going about thinking that the money got picked up by dredging, because if you look at the equipment that was used for that dredging, it would have absolutely destroyed all of the money in the bag, no questions asked. So that has to warrant another conversation. What's the other alternative? Did someone put the money there nicely, one on top of the other in the springtime? Or did it arrive there by natural means because Cooper lost the money? Because I'm inclined to think to myself that if DB Cooper got away with it and he had the money on his person, which is one of the reasons why he asked for a knapsack in the first place, he wouldn't have just left that amount of money just lying around for a laugh. He would have taken as much of it as he could with him and buggered off.
Okay, though, this is going to be a very big question, and it's going to require a little bit of speculation on your part. But you've talked about Tina Bar a little bit. You've talked about the flight path. Where did DB Cooper touch down? Because even if people think DB Cooper didn't survive the jump, he had to have landed somewhere. Where do you think that would have been?
That's a very good question, Ned. I would say near Orchards, Washington. So I believe that's pretty close to Battleground. So around that area, so like closer to Vancouver than, further up to near Ariel Amboy would be where he jumped. And if you look at the map of that area, it's actually quite an ideal place to land. And if you look at how likely it was that he would be able to land without trees in the way, without a water landing, which would have been disastrous on a night like that, even though the weather situation is often over exaggerated. Like, to land in water in that situation at night, you would have only had a few moments to, get out of there to avoid hypothermia. But I think he landed near Vancouver. I think he landed in an open field. He hailed a ride to get out of there, probably had an accomplice of some kind that picked him up, and then he escaped. Was there a second part of the question there that I didn't answer?
No, you answered that very well. Just for the audience, like, some people refer to the place that Stuart was talking about, Orchards, Washington, near Battleground. Like, they sometimes call it Battleground Orchards. I thought that was all one location, but those are two separate towns, right? There's Battleground, Washington, and there's Orchards, Washington, right? Just from clarity, right?
Yes.
Yes, and I mean, the next thing I want to talk about is something that I heard on Ryan Burns' channel, DB Cooper Sleuth, and everybody please go over and subscribe to his channel as well. It's amazing. And he had Jude Morrow on the program, who said that the money that was found at Tina Bar was analyzed and that it had diatoms that were from the rivers in the nearby area. And he said if the money was in the river, then Cooper was in the water at some point. Do you think there is sufficient evidence to say that DB Cooper either landed in the water or he was in the water at some point based on the money?
No. Jude's a very good investigator, and he's definitely someone that has put a lot of time and thought and attention into his theory that Cooper didn't make it. He died once he hit the ground, and, or within a couple of days, a couple of hours, for whatever reason. But unfortunately, he's wrong when it comes to if the money's in the water, then he was in the water at some point. The diatoms were springtime diatoms. So unless he lost the money in the jump and then landed in the water later on, that theory is not going to suffice. There's also another point as well, which is, we never saw any other evidence wash up anywhere. We never saw a parachute or a briefcase or something like that. And, it's probably quite likely that briefcase could have very likely floated. I mean, if he just chucked it out the plane before he jumps, then there would be a very good chance it would have been found by now if it hadn't landed in the water. But let's say it did land in the water. It just depends on what contents were in that briefcase exactly. If it was something which was not heavy, that briefcase could have just been floating along the water, and it wouldn't have been too hard to spot it from somewhere, whether it was ship going up and down the route near Tinaba or in the Columbia or somewhere else. So the jury's very much still out on that one. And even just with like the flight path itself, Ryan Burns does a great deal of investigative work into how much time they actually spent in the flight path where it could have been a water landing. And the numbers were just so phenomenally low to almost be insignificant. Like, there's an almost guaranteed chance that he landed somewhere on land rather than in the water, unless he knew how to steer the parachute, which wasn't steerable anyway.
Okay, though, Stuart, you've been a guest on the Cooper Vortex in the past, hosted by Darren Schaefer. I've also been a guest on that program as well. And one question that Darren likes to ask everybody is, was D.B. Cooper's bomb real? Because you talked about the briefcase that contained what appeared to have been a bomb. Do you think that was real?
Yes. If you look at all of the steps that were taken, Ned, to make sure that hijacking took place, and D.B. Cooper made sure that he got what he wanted, that bomb needed to have some level of threat, and it needed to be threatening enough to scare people into complying. So even though I said on the D.B. Cooper Vortex that Cooper knew how to market himself effectively as a threat, that threat also needed to be backed up with something, and that bomb needed to be real. Because if you think about what could have happened if the FBI had stormed that plane and gone after Cooper, he says they're not going to. He said multiple times they're not going to take me alive. So he needed to make sure that that bomb actually worked and was real, because if it was just turned out to be a dud, and if someone figured out it was a dud, all you needed was one person from the military who had experience with bomb making to have a look at the bomb over D.B. Cooper's shoulder and say, oh yeah, that's just a fake. Bill Mitchell could have jumped him, tackled him to the ground. He would have been arrested at the airport. But because he managed to keep a low profile, and because he managed to convince Schaffner and Mucklow that the bomb was real, which I do think it was, it always got him. They managed to get him what he wanted, and it managed to ensure that Northwest Airlines wasn't going to jeopardize their plane in place of the FBI just going rogue and trying to shoot Cooper up the plane.
Okay, this will tie into the next question then. What do you make of the story that the D.B. Cooper was reported to have opened the briefcase and it appeared to have red dynamite that was used to create the bomb? And dynamite isn't typically red, it's either orange or yellow. What do you make of that? Do you think that that was dynamite? Do you think it was something else? Like, I know you said you think the bomb is real. Some people think that it was a dud and he was using road flares, which are traditionally red. But like, what do you think about the dynamite that was used for the creation of the bomb?
Well, it's quite easy to cover that, Ned, because all you need to do is go and find some red material fabric that can be used to cover the dynamite. Like people were saying back then, dynamite normally was like had a tan color appearance. So all you needed was to, get some other red material of some kind and cover it up. And, that could just be something that could accompany it and just make it look sort of a lot more cartoony, Looney Tunes style dynamite color that someone who maybe watched cartoons when they were a kid would recognize and think, oh my gosh, that actually is dynamite. So it might have just been used likely to create that illusion that it was indeed dynamite and the dynamite that they've seen on TV.
Right, this isn't so much a question, but rather a comment. Just when I was watching Ryan Burns's channel, DB Cooper Sleuth, he did point out through the investigative process that they determined that, yes, red dynamite did exist. One of the colors that was used, for the creation of dynamite was red. And also, I think that this is kind of something that I'm guessing on, but one thing I've thought about is that I don't know how long the people were actually looking at the bomb. Does he just kind of like open the briefcase and be like, hey, here's my bomb, and close it? If it's orange and they see like the mechanism and the sticks of dynamite or whatever it is, I mean, you could easily mistake orange for red in a split second, because as you just said, Stuart, we have this commonly held belief that dynamite is red because of cartoons. When you watch cartoons, they frequently use red dynamite, and as opposed to, like live action shows, sometimes they use the tan colored dynamite, as you brought up. And I mention that very frequently on Black Box Online Radio. I like to say that it just shocked me the first time I saw that on a live action TV show when they were using like yellow dynamite or something. I was like, what? Dynamite's supposed to be red because of cartoons, right? But again, that's not so much a question. It's just, I think that there are numerous explanations about why the dynamite could have appeared that way. But do you know how long did the flight attendants look at the bomb when DB Cooper presented it?
I don't, Ned. It sounded like it was very brief glimpses of it. So it's not going to be long enough for you to, properly formulate like a comprehensive an idea of whether it's genuine dynamite or not. It could be some other type of clever invention that he came up with as well, like, that could have exploded in another way. If you look at like the Unabomber 10 Kaczynski, like I had no idea about like, pipe bombs and that sort of thing until watching the documentary about what Ted Kaczynski did as the Unabomber. And it was quite a shock to the system to find out that that sort of thing is possible.
Okay, yes, I mean that's a fair point though, but we're talking about some of the myths of the DB Cooper case. And one you brought up is DB Cooper may have had an accomplice. Now there are a lot of people out there who will say that it is impossible for DB Cooper to have had an accomplice. Why are they wrong?
I'm not going to go as far as to say that they're wrong, Ned. I'll just say that it's quite easy for it to be justified. All he would need to do is get to a payphone and call somebody and ask them to pick him up, tell them where he is roughly based on where he jumped out, which, if he knew the plane speed and how long they'd been in the air, wouldn't be too hard, and call them for help, and they can come and pick him up from an agreed location, and that would be the accomplice theory. It would be impossible, if the accomplice was on the ground and agreed to meet them at a certain place, because I don't think he knew where he was when he jumped out of the plane. But once he had deployed the parachute, it wouldn't have taken him too long to figure out his bearings and be able to identify whereabouts it is that he's likely to land.
Right. The only thing that I would challenge on that is, I mean, when some people say that it's impossible for DB Cooper to have had an accomplice, I would say that as a blanket statement, that there's something fundamentally wrong about that. You brought up a very good point that they could have just, he could have gone to a payphone and called somebody. I've had Pat Boland as a guest on the program. She's also talked about how maybe DB Cooper had somebody drive him into Portland, so he, like the accomplice is transporting him that way. In the book Into the Blast by Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins, they even speculate that maybe the accomplice could have been sitting on the plane as one of the other passengers to intervene if something went into a catastrophe. So there are numerous examples that have been put forward about how the accomplice theory could have worked. But it's always interesting to know what people think about this. And now, Stuart, you can use as much imagination as you want. Can you give me a play-by-play of what happens after DB Cooper lands? Because you've talked about the accomplice, you talked about DB Cooper surviving the jump. What do you think happens after DB Cooper touches down on the ground?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What I think happens is he gets down on the ground. I think he's certainly quite shaken. There's definitely quite a lot of ground shot, possibly an injury of some kind from the landing, unless he has some sort of glow stick or torch or road flare at his handy in order to see the ground that's coming up. From there, I think he walks towards the nearest road or railway line and follows his nose to the nearest township or city, and either calls an accomplice to get help to escape, or he books himself in to a hotel for the night or motel. Or if he is near the Portland area, he gets a ride to the Portland airport and navigates his way back to the vehicle which he left behind and disappears. And I'm not saying that I can prove that conclusively, but I think it's the likely scenario as to what happened. I think he used either the roads or the railway lines to find his way back to civilization. And from there, he either went to his vehicle or he booked himself in or flew out the next day undetected and changed his appearance as well whilst he was at it, because it would have been one of the worst things in the world to do, to have the exact same appearance that you did the day before, especially whilst the sketch is being compiled of what the hijacker looked like.
Right, excellent answer. But I was talking about the book Into the Blast, which I did the book discussion on last week for Cooper Friday. I invite everyone to check out that episode. But in that book, Skip Porteous and Robert Levins talk about D.B. Cooper lands, and they think that he buried the parachute in the ground. Then he took more or less the knapsack and put the bomb briefcase as well as the money into the backpack and then walked out that way. Do you think that D.B. Cooper buried the parachute in the ground?
Yes, there was no need for him to take it with him. It just would have been extra weight. It would have slowed him down significantly, which wouldn't have been helpful, particularly after the hard landing. And with the briefcase as well, same thing too. He would have likely taken what he needed, likely that canvas bag which people mentioned seeing. I think he took that with him. I don't think he took the briefcase. And he probably would have buried it deep enough that no weather conditions, like, say some heavy rain or flooding or something like that, could have just pushed it up to the surface anytime soon. I think he would have done quite a thorough dig in order to get rid of it, rather than a surface level one. And that's probably one of the reasons why no one has to date been able to find the parachute or the briefcase.
Okay, though, so we have D.B. Cooper is landing, he's getting in touch with his accomplice, and I think you've already laid it out, you don't believe that he held on to the money, correct?
No, I think he lost it in the jump. And
go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think it would have been quite frustrating for him, because if you think about this caper that he was trying to pull off, Ned, you've literally gotten lucky so many times in the course of the last 5 hours, only to stuff it up when it counted the most. It's one of the reasons why he wanted the money in a knapsack, so he could just jump out with it like it was a front chute. And the money would be secure. Not some flimsy canvas bag that he had to MacGyver shut and then jump out of the plane with it, sort of dangling between his legs. It would have been quite a frustrating moment, actually, to have hit the ground knowing that the only money that you've got is what's on your person. Whether he stuffed some money from the ransom into his pockets, we can only speculate about that. I think he probably did, but it's unlikely he would have used that money straight away, knowing that there could have been a chance it was money that was tracked.
Yes, that would be very frustrating indeed if, he went through the whole DB Cooper heist, as some people would call it, just to lose the money almost immediately after jumping out of the plane. I think that he would be frustrated, and if there was an accomplice involved, that would be even more frustrating. That would almost magnify the situation. But I do want to touch on something that you asked about, or you were talking about rather, and that is that DB Cooper lands. You think he survives the jump, he gets in touch with someone, he gets a ride, and he alters his appearance. Now, I want to kind of know what you think about the claims that people make about how DB Cooper may have been wearing disguises on the plane. He may have had a toupee wig. He may have been wearing makeup to make himself look older. What do you think about all that?
I don't think he really went to great lengths to disguise himself, Ned. Probably the only thing that he could have done was have dyed his hair, because there were some witnesses that said that his hair color looked odd, or his hair looked odd in general. And that probably speaks to a rather shoddy job of trying to dye your hair and maybe mask some of the grays going through the sides of your hair. And in terms of makeup, well, the flight attendants, were very into their makeup. That was probably one of the big requirements of their job, to look as nice as they possibly could. And I would think that Tina Mucklow especially would have noticed pretty quickly if he was wearing makeup or not, as would Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock. All flight attendants, all of whom wore makeup, and all who would be able to identify straight away that he's got makeup on here, he's got a bit of makeup on his neck or wherever it was, and none of them said that it looked like he was wearing makeup at all. So I dispute that, and it kind of does eliminate the younger suspects. If truth be told, Cooper suspects under 40, unless they've really aged horribly, most of the time can just be eliminated on that basis alone. I think Cooper was probably 50 or older, to be perfectly honest.
50. Wow, that is quite old, because I noticed this as a newcomer to the DB Cooper case, that the suspect age ranges are just all up and down the spectrum. We got people like Robert Raxall being 28, Richard McCoy being 29, and then Milton Vordahl on the other end being 58 years old. And I'm just thinking, well, now wait a second, is this guy 58 years old or 28 years old? Because when you look at a 28-year-old person, other than certain exceptions, you don't really think that they're 58. I mean, what kind of age range are we dealing with? And you can even, use that as a question, respond the way you want. Like, how old do you think that DB Cooper would have been? 50? Is that your answer?
Yeah, between 50 and 60, Ned. It's very, very unlikely that he was older than 60, which at that time in 1971 would be the equivalent of someone being in the sort of 70 age range, in terms of like the medicine and all of the other modern health advancements that we've made now. Plus, Cooper was a smoker as well. So if he was older than 60, then there would be some signs that he would be that age. Probably most notably that he'd have some sort of cough on him if he smoked like he did on that flight in everyday life.
Now, to ask you a very big question, even though you don't have a suspect, it sounds like a lot of things that you have said point you toward Milton Vordahl as being DB Cooper. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I probably would agree, Ned. Not to say that Milton Vordahl is someone that I place a lot of weight on, but he's definitely a very convincing suspect, far more so than Kenny Christensen or Walter Recker or Vince Peterson or any of those other suspects. Like if you combined the skill set of Ted Braden with Milton Vordahl, I would almost say you'd have DB Cooper. You would just need to identify them. But unfortunately, we haven't identified definitively who DB Cooper is, because we haven't managed to find someone with Milton Vordahl's temperament and personality and Ted Braden's skill set. And when we do find that person, we could probably all celebrate that we've solved the case.
Right, because you were talking about someone who's over age 50, and you also said at the beginning of the interview that you were looking at someone who may have had connection to the rare metals that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie, and that sounded a little bit like Milton Fordall. But I was watching Drew Beeson's channel once, and he asked a challenge question to the audience. And everybody who listens to Black Box Online Radio knows that I can't resist challenge questions, so I'll give it to you, Stuart. If you had to choose somebody to recreate the DB Cooper skyjacking out of the known suspects that we have, whom would you choose? When you got to think, which person do I want to skyjack the plane, demand the $200,000 sky jack as well, I said, but also jump into the night, into cloud cover, into the rain? Which DB Cooper suspect would you choose?
Well, it's a bit of a loaded question there, Ned, because I think
Absolutely, it is.
Drew knows that most people would say Ted Braden because he's got the skill set and the temperament and the personality to pull off a caper like that, because not many people are going to jump at night into the abyss, not know their location, with a parachute that's non-steerable. And yet Braden would be daring enough to go and do something like that simply because of the sheer force of his own personality and the confidence that he has in his own abilities. So he would be someone that you would say conclusively would be one of those people because he was fearless. And that's something that Cooper, whether we want to admit it or not, Cooper actually was quite fearless in the outcome. Like, it's almost seemed like he was not bothered whether or not he lived or died in this whole situation, which was probably one of the reasons why he was so calm in the first place.
Yes, and that was a purely loaded question, but I mean, I would choose Ted Braden as well to recreate the skyjacking because, as you said, he knew what to do and he knew how to go about that, and he would have had the brain and personality for it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's DB Cooper 100%. As you said at the beginning of the interview, we need things like DNA or maybe if someone's belongings turn up like some $20 bills that have the serial numbers that have been recorded, that's harder evidence than just profiling. But I once heard an interview with Mike Davis where he said that because D.B. Cooper chose to jump at night, that indicated that he had a military background because civilians don't normally parachute at night. They don't go skydiving during the nighttime, but the military is trained to do that. What do you make of that statement?
It's definitely true that the military does jump at night. However, most of the time, the military knows roughly whereabouts they are going to be jumping. So, you can spin it both ways, Ned. I would say it probably does speak to the fact that Cooper was a little overconfident in his own abilities and that he probably did have some parachuting experience, but not as much as Ted Braden did.
Does that mean you think Ted Braden is overqualified to be DB Cooper?
I'm not saying that he's overqualified. I would just say that Braden would probably know with a little bit more confidence where he is, and he would have wanted to have known where he was before making the jump. He wouldn't have just said, no, I'm all good, nothing to worry about here, and then just bailed out without knowing where he was, unless there was some sort of gear that he had in that that canvas bag, which we don't know about. But there's no evidence to show that there was navigational gear in the canvas bag that DB Cooper used.
Well, I don't mean to challenge you exactly. I'm more just like asking, trying to clarify. What do you think about the claims that DB Cooper knew where he was because he was estimating the amount of time that it would have taken to go from Seattle to southern Washington, and by jumping out, he could have easily estimated that he was between Vancouver and Portland, purely based on the amount of time. And then once he's in the air, he can use the city lights of Portland and the city lights of Vancouver, Washington, as well as possibly the Merwin Dam, the dam that was in the area that should have had a bunch of bright floodlights on. What do you make of those claims that he could have estimated that and done it reasonably well, just purely based on the surroundings and the time?
He definitely could have. Like, if you look at the cloud cover there, it sounded like, from what Bill Radachik said, that it wasn't just completely thick cloud cover that they were flying through. It did seem like there was enough breaks in the cloud. And if you were standing on the edge of the the steps of the 727 aft stairs, Ned, one of the things that you would do is you would look for lights and ensure that, you know, it's a good time to jump and it's not just like a crazy time to jump. And that was something which Cooper likely did do. He probably would have waited for a break in the clouds before making the jump, looked at the break in the cover in clouds and gone for it, because there was so much uncertainty and so many things that he did actually leave to chance, that using a guesstimate with the city lights and the sort of jump time and all of those things, and looking at all of the other things Cooper had prepared for with the sort of flight configuration, he probably would have factored in as well the drift that would have taken place with deploying the parachute at certain stages, and that probably would have factored into his jump situation as well and whereabouts he did it. But I think he did look at where he was, and he probably did wait for a break in the clouds to see city lights or town lights, and then went ahead and made the jump. And how exactly he timed it is open to speculation, but there's pretty good evidence to suggest that he wouldn't have just jumped willy-nilly. He would have looked for some sort of landmark first before going ahead and jumping.
Now, this episode of Cooper Friday is winding down, so Stuart, right now I would like to give you the floor. Do you have any final notes about DB Cooper, any final message that you would like to share with the audience? And also, if you want to talk about your website at all, you can share that as well. So I'm going to give you the floor, and it's yours.
Yep, thanks very much, Ned. Look, probably the biggest thing is that DB Cooper likely had experience working at McCord Air Force Base. If you look at the knowledge that he had of the local area, it doesn't strike anybody who has looked far into it as a place that he would be a regular in, because it would be quite foolish to hijack in a place which you could get recognized. But I do think that at some point in time, he had experience working out in the Pacific Northwest, either in his military service or at a later point as a contractor to the military. So hence his knowledge of the Tacoma from a flight path to Seattle, and also the distance from the Seattle airport to the McCord Air Force Base. Cooper was also someone that likely had some sort of mental health challenges that he faced in life, and those had been aggravated to a point where he had convinced himself that hijacking an airliner was the best way to escape from the current situation that he was in, likely a heavy, financially stressful situation. So I think a lot more investigation and investigative work needs to be done into those areas and how he developed a knowledge of the area and where that was born about. More investigation should probably be made into the people that worked at the McCord base through the years and evaluate whether or not any of them match the Cooper traits and attributes, but at a younger age. And same thing as well for the PTSD traits which Cooper possessed at the time, and some of the other mental health challenges he possibly could have been going through, and how that factored in. I will say as well that if anybody is interested in connecting with me, they are more than welcome to go to my website, PaidAdvertisingHelp.com. Always happy to discuss DB Cooper and hear about people's theories and thoughts on the case. And that's it, Ned.
Stuart MacAdam, thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, Ned. Thank you.